Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Handwashing Innovations Think Tank. My name is Erin Calamaris, and I work with the Global Handwashing Partnership Secretariat. And I would like to welcome you all to the third session of the Think Tank focused on gender and hygiene. Orange Up, if you could go to the next slide, please. So before I pass it to our session facilitators, I'd like to go over some housekeeping and virtual guidance to ensure a smooth session today. Next slide, please. So for those of you that have attended previous Think Tank sessions, this should all look very familiar. First, please keep yourself muted and video off unless you're speaking. When we do get into the discussions, please just use the raise hand feature if you would like to speak, so our facilitators can call on you. We will be using breakout rooms for this session, and we'll explain how those will work later on. And we have included a shared Google folder with all Think Tank materials. This was sent out to you over email, and we'll also post it in the chat now. If you don't have access to a Google Drive, I've sent over a downloaded copy of the resources from today's session over email, and we'll also send additional materials for each session as they come in. And lastly, these sessions are being recorded. We are using these recordings for notes-taking purposes to develop the Think Tank report, and we also plan to use these recordings during the future regional discussions on these same Think Tank topics. So with that, I'd like to introduce you all to today's facilitators. They have a very interactive session planned to get us thinking around gender issues in hand hygiene. First up, we have Sean White, a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we also have Unita Bartel, a hygiene specialist at UNICEF HQ. So over to you both, and thanks again.
Thanks so much, Erin, for that introduction. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's session, where we're going to be reflecting on considerations around gender within hygiene programming. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So to start off with, I just wanted to mention kind of how we arrived at this topic. So through the discussions as a coordination committee, we recognize that we've seen an increasing amount of research and programmatic focus on inclusive wash within recent years. And partly this might have been spurred on by the SDGs, but I think it's also really been met with sector-wide agreement that this is something that's kind of critical to consider within our work. So inclusive wash is, of course, a very broad umbrella, and we want to recognize that gender is obviously only a small part of this. And we've chosen to focus on gender today because it's a topic that we feel there's an existing body of evidence around gender and wash, and because there are documented programs where we've been trying to get better at considering gender within wash programming. And lastly, because we feel that this topic has kind of an ethical or moral component, which requires not just evidence, but also discussions in terms of how we make decisions as a sector. So we hope that today's format might actually be used in future to shape other discussions about related topics. So this could include, for example, decolonizing hygiene programming or strengthening the way that we engage with marginalized groups. Next slide, please. So we've got a pretty exciting lineup of presentations and discussions over the next 2 hours, but at the same time, our schedule is also quite tight. So we will be asking our presenters to try and stick strictly to the time that we've allotted, and we'll be asking each of you to try and keep to the guidance provided when it comes to presenting within plenary sessions. So we're going to start today's session by hearing from Bethany Caruso at Emory University. And she's going to be setting the scene for us in terms of summarizing what is known about hygiene, gender, and inequality. And at the end of Bethany's presentation, we will have a very brief period of time for any clarifying questions, for anything that's unclear in her presentation. And so we would ask you to either write your questions in the chat or to raise your hand in the function on Zoom, and then we'll call on you. And this will apply after each of the presentations you hear today. The next part of today's session will feature 2 case studies, one on a project in India called SuperAmma, and another on a case study from Nepal on Mum's Magic Hands. And these case studies are designed to act as practical examples for us to discuss. So we will then go into 6 breakout rooms, and you'll be asked to discuss a particular question in relation to these examples. And then we'll return to plenary, and each group will have a chance to present their ideas. We'll then go, we're going to be kind of zooming out a little bit from the practical programming questions to higher level questions about the role of hygiene, the role of the hygiene sector in terms of changing gender norms. And at this point, we're going to invite Ben Chislagi to present on lessons learned from outside of the hygiene sector in terms of approaches to changing gender norms. And so this will lead us into the last session where we've got a debate which we're organizing for you. And so we're hoping that through this debate, we'll identify some ways of moving forward as a sector. Next slide, please. Before we start today, I would like us to just agree on some simple ground rules. So we don't want anyone in the session feeling a bit like this chicken on the slide here. We would like the discussion itself to be guided by evidence, but we recognize that some of our decision making on this topic will raise moral questions. And we hope that in today's session, people feel like open to express a range of opinions, including perhaps even things that might be controversial or that are useful thought experiments to discuss in this safe environment. So we ask all of you to be open-minded about what others are saying and also willing to re-evaluate your own opinions as we progress through the session. So if you're happy with these principles, can I ask you to please type yes in the chat box? Great, I see yeses coming through. That's great. Thank you for your open-mindedness. So I'm now going to hand over to Bethany Caruso at Emory University, who's done an awful lot of work on gender over the years, focusing on water sanitation and hygiene. We'll be swapping over to Bethany so that she can present her slides, but we're hoping that Bethany's presentation will really set the scene to help frame our discussion today.
Great, thanks, Sean. And I will share my screen as soon as I am able to do so.
Hold on, I'm giving you permissions now.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you all. Thank you to Sean and everyone for inviting me to chat today. Full disclosure that my focus of work is on this intersection between WASH and gender and behavior, but most recently I've been focusing more heavily on sanitation and behaviors and water behaviors. So that being said, I enjoy talking with you all, and hopefully this will be an opportunity to expand my horizons even further. So just in terms of setting the stage of today, I'm going to talk about some key terms and definitions at first, specifically about what we mean by when we're talking about sex and what we mean by we're talking about gender. Thinking about differences in sex and gender in terms of practice, in terms of hand hygiene needs and practice. Thinking also about some sex and gender related consequences, and then kind of closing on considerations for programming. So what do we mean when we talk about sex and gender, and specifically in this sort of development context? So in terms of sex, and this might be redundant for you all, but I do think it's useful to go over because these differences are slight but important. I leverage a definition by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation because I do think it's a little bit more up to date than other definitions, which strictly tend to categorize sex as just these polar opposites between male and female. But this definition talks about the biological categorization of a person as male, female, or intersex. And it's often conflated with gender, this term, but it's really important to think that sex is specifically something that we think about based on these biological indicators that include hormones, sex chromosomes, internal reproductive organs, and the like. Because they're commonly conflated, sex and gender, it can contribute to erroneous beliefs that cultural practices and norms around gender are biologically determined, and they're not. And so that leads us then to our definition about gender. Gender is socially and culturally constructed. It's based on ideas of what it is to be male or female in a specific context, not on biology. So, you know, what we see is that gender is enacted in roles, responsibilities, attitudes, and behaviors that society expects and considers appropriate for males to perform and for females to perform. And that is based on, you know, the societal expectations, but not necessarily how an individual chooses to identify. It's important to know that these are learned, and very important to know that these are also changeable over time. And that's also some place where we as practitioners, even in the wash space, have a role to play. It's also important to note that these expectations also intersect with other factors, and I'll get to more on that in just a minute. Additionally, because there are these pressures to perform or conform, there can be sanctions, penalties or punishments for not adhering to gender expectations, not performing as you're expected to perform in your role as woman, as mom, as male. And it's also a relational concept. And so we understand gender best when we're looking at and examining the interactions between individuals and also groups. And these are very different and can change among cultures and between cultures. Okay, now our last definition. This last definition is intersectionality. And it's important to keep in mind, and I think also important given what Sean was talking about, we're gonna focus today specifically on gender, but we don't think about gender isn't, there's just not male or female. We are complex people. We have myriad identities, and these identities interact with our gender. So intersectionality is a perspective that acknowledges the concrete experiences of inequality that can result from this interaction of gender with these other social markers of identity or difference. And so these can include, but are also not limited to, age, race, class, caste, religion, ability, sexual orientation, and how people choose their own gender identity and expression. Importantly, these can compound already existing forms of discrimination, and it acknowledges that there are differences within and among groups. Women and men are not just homogeneous groups. They also have other identities that can compound to create or amplify these unequal opportunities and also differences in access to resources. So I'm putting that all out there because I think it's really important to consider what we're talking about when we're thinking about hand hygiene programming. Are we talking about issues related to sex? Are we talking about issues related to gender? Are we talking about intersectional issues? So now we're going to move into thinking about these differences in regards to needs and practice. And I invite you here actually to think about and type in, if we have a minute, any thoughts that you have on what you see as some sex-specific hygiene needs. And sex-specific can be related to men and women. And I have a few down, but you all are the experts on hand hygiene. So please share and come up with a few in the chat box. And these would be specifically, as a reminder on the bottom, things that would be related to the biological categorization of a person as male or female. Ron says menstrual hygiene, hand washing after changing menstrual materials and washing the body. Yeah, this is spot on. In terms of during childbirth, this is great. And so, yeah, please keep them coming. So two of the things that I've come up with that you've noted, I really like that Camilla added during childbirth also. But so, you know, hand and body washing for managing menstruation, post-pregnancy, and also other types of vaginal bleeding. It's also important to note that there's hand and body washing related to incontinence. We don't talk about incontinence that much. It's growing thanks to many in this space right now. And I mention that as a sex-specific biological need because risks of incontinence are higher for women, especially as women age and have more children. Also because there's a risk of incontinence due to childbirth as well. And then, so what are some gender expectations related to hand hygiene? And again, please add some comments in the chat. this one might be a little bit harder for people sometimes. Women are responsible for hygiene at home, says Camila. Food and home hygiene more generally, in charge of hygiene at home, fetching water for hand hygiene, taking child for vaccination, mothers cooking and feeding baby. Women are better about hygiene. Yeah, this is all spot on. And so please keep them coming, because this is great, because this is going to sort of amplify all that I'm going to talk about. You know, we have some biological needs that we talked about, but then these gender expectations actually can be different depending on where we are, but also quite similar. I mean, it's actually quite fascinating how the world over globally, we see statistics that women and girls are typically expected to provide water for their household members, to wash anything, to drink water, but to wash hands, to do you know, utensils and the like. They're also responsible for washing hands of dependents or washing dependents as well. And this can include children, the elderly, or other people with various needs that cannot necessarily do these things by themselves. Simultaneously, it's important to note that because of their gender, it is quite typical, not homogeneous, but typical, that women and men might have different access to resources for purchasing soap. They might have different or limited freedom of movement for accessing markets or public spaces for getting water and soap and other needs related to hygiene. And so those gender expectations around movement, about money, about decision-making can hamper the ability to perform hand hygiene, despite the fact that the expectation is that women are sort of good at hygiene in the home. The other thing is that there are key times that we often focus on related to hand hygiene. And this idea of piggybacking, which is an important behavior change concept, but we're typically talking about behaviors that are attributed by gender, and specifically women and girls, like changing diapers, preparing food, caring for someone who is sick. Now, what's also important, and I failed to put on here, is that there are also male-centric behaviors like caring for animals, depending on what type of animals they are, whether they're farm animals or animals in the home, that can vary depending on, you know, washing your hands after, you know, being with animals. It depends on the type of animals in the space, which gender, whether men or women would be in charge of that. And so I wanted to also just touch briefly on some sex and gender related consequences of some of these barriers and responsibilities as well. So, and I want to focus specifically on water, because in fact, that's where the majority of the research has taken place. And it just kind of gives a snapshot. Of course, there is more to be said, but in just a few minutes of time, this is a good place to focus. So as I noted, and as you all know, household water provision is predominantly a female task globally. Multiple studies continue to show this. And this can have a lot of impacts on time use, not being able to do other activities because of water fetching. Disproportionate amount of energy expended just to get water, which is exacerbated during times of scarcity. Pain from carrying water and injury. Road casualties, risk of assault, dangerous terrain. Social conflict at water points between other women and also between men who may have priorities for other types of water needs. Exposure to parasites like schistosomiasis, malaria, or other types of soil transmitted helminths. School absenteeism has been noted, anxiety and distress in times of scarcity, gender-based violence, and also potential increased risk of exposure to COVID and other types of infectious pathogens, you know, specifically in times of thinking about at crowded water points, waiting in line without spacing, depending on where this might be. And from one paper, I just pulled out a few quotes just to sort of make an example of some of these pieces. One woman said, "If he can't wash his face and hands, he will beat me." Another said, "When our children go to school, we send them with dirty faces." And 24% of those who were interviewed noted that in times of scarcity, they reduced the amount of water used for hand washing specifically. And now I'm just going to end with some just brief comments for considerations related to programming that I hope will lend themselves well to the conversation that's coming. So I wanted to put up, I took a screenshot yesterday of Julia's great slides. And I wanted to do this because I want to sort of link these presentations and demonstrate how these pieces are all important to consider together. This is a really great report. So amplifying that again and encouraging you all to read and look it over if you haven't. But I wanted to just sort of indicate how gender can come into our thinking about some of these and how we shouldn't necessarily leave our thinking around gender behind. So this first principle in terms of ensuring supportive environments, products for new behavior are immediately and consistently available. Absolutely. Just remember and understand that where the burden and therefore the blame might fall for creating that enabling environment if we're encouraging that in the household. So like I said, the provision of water, the provision of soap is a gendered task. And so if the enabling environment is not as it's supposed to be, there might be gender related reasons for why that is the case. And then in number 2, in terms of leveraging context, by disruption, whether, by piggybacking or on an old behavior. So there's been conversation around making sure you're, piggybacking on top of, birth and having a new child is a good time to promote messages, for example. But it's also important that sometimes piggybacking, so be careful, just being mindful of how we're piggybacking, might actually enforce gender norms around what it means to be a good mother or a good wife. And therefore, what happens then if women are not capable of living up to that standard? Are there harms? We talked before, I showed briefly some quotes about, what happens when women cannot necessarily live up to the expectations that are put on them. There could be harmful consequences to them in the household. In terms of number 3, eliminating friction, like choice and steps and perceived efforts. One of the things that I think is important is that we consider who is always targeted to help reduce friction. And I say this not with just hand hygiene in mind. We consistently target women for water treatment programs over and over again. And it makes sense in some ways because we're thinking, well, women are the people providing water. They're fetching the water, they're giving it to their children, they're the ones responsible for the water. We should target women. But at the same time, are we targeting women as vehicles for our program success or also for their own well-being down the road too? Some programs do both. But if we're just targeting women to use their time and to use their energy to leverage their role as the good mother or wife, what are the potential impacts of that for the sake of our program success alone? And then the final one in terms of promoting meaning and motivation, encouraging meaning making around habit. This is another important place where we need to consider these harms around meaning making and what, again, is the consequences for the exceptional mom or wife status. And are we considering them? And I just want to sort of return to this picture. You might not have seen it very well on a previous slide of intersectionality, but returning to this, that these other identities that intersect with gender can also compound some of the ways that we think of these roles and responsibilities in our programming. And then finally, I just want to sort of end on this final part around incorporating gender into hand washing programming. And many of you have probably seen this sort of scale where we think about from the red, the practices that can be harmful, including where we're doing programming that perpetuates gender inequality by enforcing these norms, to those that ignore these gender differences in norms and roles and responsibilities, to those that are aware of them in the yellow, they're sensitive to them. Then moving on to the green, if we're responsive, we're understanding and we're actually thinking about benefits to women and men in the programming, and all the way to transformative spaces where actually what we're doing through our programming is not just achieving our WASH related goals, but it's actually doing something to promote gender equality. In the WASH sector, we're We're not really there yet, but I think it's somewhere we should start to aim to put our effort more, moving beyond the success of our programming, just for the sake of hand washing and health outcomes, but also this transformative space of promoting and enabling gender equality. So it's important to think about, why does a program engage women and girls? Is it solely for the purpose of achieving those program goals? And does the program benefit women or girls? How, and according to whose perspective? We don't always measure or assess that. And I'm just going to throw up one more slide here that shows a different way of picturing this, that kind of makes these pieces a little bit more evident, that when we're on this sort of far end on the left-hand side, there's a risk of gender inequality and exploitative programming. And so what we want to do is use this as a guide potentially to think about how our programming might be actually accommodating and transformative and not exploitative. And I'm going to end there, and thank you all very much. And I look forward to the conversations and learning more with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bethany. That was really useful framing, particularly as we go into, I think, some of our discussions. It would be great if we can all be conscious of some of those concepts. Great, so if we can share the main slide deck again, I'm now going to be handing over to Katie Greenland, again from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Katie is going to be talking through a relatively well-known program called SuperAmma. It is going to be taking a bit of a step back in time. This was an intervention that was done almost 7 years ago. So yeah, over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Shan. Yes, I joined London School in 2011 when SuperAmma was happening and the intervention had been developed. And I was in the field a fair bit, and my role was really with evaluation and measuring behaviour change. So next slide, please. Thank you. So SuperAmma, I think it's important to say, to begin with, it was a proof of principle study. So it was intended to demonstrate whether behaviour change was possible using an intervention that was scalable, of short duration, and crucially that avoided health messaging. So the study was conducted in rural Andhra Pradesh in India, and the intervention targeted a single behaviour, just hand washing with soap. This was at key times defined as after potential contact with feces and before contact with food. SuperAmma targeted all household members, not just primary caregivers, which you wouldn't necessarily think immediately from the name and from a lot of the images and materials, which you can see here. This is the SuperAmma character. The intervention was designed to be delivered over 4 days, spread out over a month, and it was delivered in just 7 villages. So it wasn't intended to be something that was initially scaled. It was just this proof of principle study. It was quite an intensive intervention, and there were quite a number of activities on each day, with ongoing activities in schools and in the community in between the days over the course of the month. So I don't have time to go in detail, but I think just to give a little bit of information that'll be useful going forwards. There were school events, the AWW is the Anganwadi, which is the nursery childcare setting. There were meetings there. There were also meetings specifically held with men to garner support, mainly support of the rest of the household, and recognizing that they held mainly the budget for things like purchase of soap, and community events during which skits and films were played. And the main film and narrative was around this super mum who helped her children. She had many activities to do over the course of the day, and she also encouraged them to have good manners, and within that encouraged their hand washing. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, the intervention was a proof of principle study delivered in 7 villages. It was evaluated through a cluster randomized control trial. It was quite small, just these 14 villages in total, as we had behavior change outcomes, not health impact. And our primary outcome was the proportion of critical times when hands were observed to be washed with soap. And this was assessed during structured observation for 3 hours in the early morning period when many of the activities of interest were going to be observed. So from about 5:30 to 8:30 in the morning. If you look at this figure, it shows the proportion of observed occasions when hand washing took place. So for example, if we saw 20 defecation events, it would be the proportion of those when somebody washed their hands after defecation was observed, or not literally observed. And you can see here in the red line, the results at baseline and then at 3 time points, 6 weeks, 6 months and 12 months after baseline. Just look at the red line here. This is the main intervention compared to the control in blue. We did then run a short version of the intervention, a 2-day intervention in the control arm between the 6 and 12 month measure. So I think the main takeaway from this is it's hard to change behavior and even harder to sustain change, but the results suggested that a non-health based campaign like SuperAmma was able to increase hand washing at key times, and that this increase in behavior was sustained at least in the short term and over 12 months. So next slide, please. So we could discuss the findings and what we learned about behavior change for a while, but today I've been asked to reflect particularly on SuperAmma and gender. And just a few thoughts really with the limited time I have. As you saw from the intervention schedule, we did target and measure behavior change amongst the whole family, and the intervention was delivered through a wide range of events in a number of different settings in the community. And then we're also a deliberate target. It was recognised all family members needed to change their behaviour in order to develop and reinforce hand washing norms. But saying that, the intervention was still developed around this SuperAmma character, and the behaviour of mothers as primary caregivers of children under 5 was considered to be most important. And that was because of the potential impact of these individuals' hand hygiene on the health of their young children, and also the role that they played in role modelling and teaching their children. The intervention concept, this good mother narrative, I think this is a tricky one because it really resonated with the target population at the time. And as Sian said, this was done a few years ago now. So there's no doubt that the fact that the concept resonated so much with the target population contributed to the intervention's high acceptability and perhaps also its success in improving behaviour, at least as measured in the short term. However, SuperAmma could be said to reinforce existing gender norms and put even more burden on already burdened mothers who are already striving to do all they can to be good mothers. It's not that any mother is trying not to be a good mother. So thinking about this, perhaps we could have focused on good parents instead of good mothers, and highlighting more in the stories the importance of fathers as well in the raising of children. But then whether or not we have a good mother or a good parent narrative, I guess, is still potentially damaging narrative if we're linking child health and success in life with hand washing performed by the parents. And if this link is so strong that parents then feel guilt or shame if they're unable to practice hand washing as they're asked to do so. So maybe we need to avoid narratives like this altogether going forwards. And there's something else that I thought about when reflecting on this intervention, and that's that we don't just have a good mother narrative in SuperAmma. It also tells the story about how the mother's actions contribute to the future success of her son, in that he grows up to become a doctor. So this is another stereotype, and again, it was developed by the Indian creative agency that we work with, and again, people really identified with this. And the study team believed that tapping into these kind of stereotypes made the intervention more powerful. I don't know whether the intervention would have worked as well with a daughter instead of a son. I think it wasn't something that was considered at the time, and I couldn't be sure because I wasn't part of those conversations. But those are just my initial reflections really on SuperAmma. I know I only have limited time, so I'll stop there. I'm sure you have more, especially those of you who've thought about gender a lot more in your work and for longer, and I look forward to learning and sharing and discussing more in this session today. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie, so much for those reflections. I would now like to invite Biju Dangle to present on our next case study. If there are any clarifying questions for the SuperAmma case study, please do add them in the chat. Over to you, Biju.
Okay, thank you. Hello and namaste, everyone. I am Biju Dangle from Oxfam, Nepal, working as a project manager. So today I am going to present about the Mom's Magic Hands, which are supported in shifting gender norms. Next slide, please. So basically this hygiene behavior change coalition project was implemented in Nepal in 10 districts from April 2020 to April 2021, and it basically focused on Mom's Magic Hand approach, where emotional motivators were mobilized to nurture and affiliation, and hygiene behavior change program was designed through storytelling activities. Basically, there was two objectives of the project. First is the sustained improvement in hygiene behavior, and another is promotion of gender care walks related to care walk. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So there were many activities conducted related to gender norms. Previous slide. Sorry, previous slide. So we have conducted another slide. So we have conducted different activities related to gender norms. So we have developed gender and care walk manual. MMH storyboard was also developed focusing on the household care walk. So, and also we have used 24 hours rapid analysis tool in order to find out the different work done by the women in order to sensitize the local people. That magic hand session was also conducted, and interaction was also done related to gender and care work, where different competitions and the social media photo context was also used, and the information was disseminated through MMS session, gender care work session, and we have also developed the animated videos on gender care work. So we have used all these materials for sensitization of the local people, and psychosocial counseling was also done related to gender-based violence. Next slide. Next slide, please. There were several achievements after intervention of the project activity. So basically there was behavior change. A previous slide. The changes were like increase in hand washing behavior, and people have also adopted the COVID prevention message as well. So while talking about the gender care walk has been reduced, and it had changed in the perception and behavior of the local people. So while talking about perception, like men and women, they have started realize and discussing about the need of gender care walk as well as the equal division of household work. And women also started discussing about different issues related to household and care work in MMS session. Previously, they used to keep idle and keep their feelings in their mind, but now they started discussing. And regarding changes in behavior, the male members have started supporting the household care work, as you can see in the figure, and male also started acting as a change agent in order to redistribute the household care work. And self-esteem and confidence of women was also raised, and women have also accepted the household care work without no longer ashamed, because previously they were ashamed, but now they are being supporting the women in household activities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And there was also changes in gender norms, like at the household level, there was increased affection and love for the women, and reduction of domestic violence, and household conflict was also decreased. Improvement in the health status of the women, and the role of women has also increased in decision-making process. Similarly, at the community level, there was positive commitment and support from the local stakeholders, and the women who were not allowed to go to the funeral rituals were allowed after the intervention of the program, and girls were also allowed to attend the school during menstrual period. And as MMH board focus on Mina character. Next slide, please. And there were many challenges during intervention of the program, like male members at the community, and the male members during the training program, they committed to support for the household work, but after they did not perform any duties, so was also done, and award was awarded to the male members, and they were eager to support the women members. And some male members, they supported at the household work, but they did not like the publicity, and they feel ashamed. So we have again mobilized the religious leaders, and awareness were raised through the media mobilization campaign. Next slide, please. And there were several lessons learned during the intervention of the project. The Mom's Magic Hand were mobilized, which were very effective in order to sensitize the local people. And engaging men in the MMH as well as the gender care work, it has created the ownership for the change. And we have also used different gender-focused tools, which have increased the effectiveness of the program. And different tools to sensitize the gender and care work has mobilized the local people in order to promote the gender norms. And the long-term program is very necessary to see the changes, behavior change at the community level. And we have also supported with the hygiene kit, isolation kit, as well as the dignity kit for the vulnerable people, especially focusing on the pregnant lactating mother, as well as the elderly people. So there are many learnings after the implementation opportunity to present and share my experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biju. I think we did have some connectivity issues there, but the slides are available in the shared folder if there were any sections of that that you feel like you want to go back to revise. We will be now breaking you out into 6 small groups, and what we would like you to discuss in those groups is the question you see here on this slide. So what additional concrete actions could be taken to ensure hygiene programs like SuperAmma or Mum's Magic Hands do not perpetuate restrictive gender norms? So once you join your allocated group, I would like you to open the Google spreadsheet, which we'll be adding in the chat in just a moment. And I would like you to identify one person in the group to take notes and come up with a few key points in relation to this question. And then I would also like you in your group to identify one person to be the spokesperson when we return to plenary. And that person will be sharing just one key insight on behalf of your group. So we'll be breaking you now into your groups, and you'll have 15 minutes to discuss. Thank you. The spokesperson from that group unmute, please.
Okay, this is Jackie, and we didn't get to finish and come up with a spokesperson, but I can say one thing, and maybe any of my colleagues can add. We talked about, sometimes accurately reflecting the conditions of the community, but while reinforcing stereotypes. So it's important to have accurate data and avoid, reinforcing stereotypes and even in the ways we name the, projects we do, like the SuperAmma or Mom's Magic.
Great, thank you very much. And room 2, which was Abby, Bethany, John, and Michael, if your spokesperson could unmute and share one key insight.
I think we forgot to pick a spokesperson, but I'm happy to just sort of share one point that we discussed, which was it's not necessarily a bad thing to leverage existing norms, provided that kind of sort of in the way that Oxfam did, there was a mind to understanding how norms and expectations could potentially also change. So, their experience resulted in these sort of changes in those norms and differences in decision making and voice within the household. And so one of the things is just that it's critical then, though, to measure and assess these potential impacts and not necessarily assume that your program is just inherently good because it's targeting women, so it will inherently help them, but to sort of critically assess what the potential benefits and potential harms may or may not be.
Wonderful, thank you for that nuanced reflection. Room 3, which comprised of Ben, Heidi, and Ida. If we could have your spokesperson, please.
Sure. So this is Ida from Room 3. So a lot of the things that have actually been touched on are things that we discussed too. One thing though to add was around, sort of the pressures that could be associated with being, the ideal mom or an ideal person. So maybe instead focusing on the household level, so how together maybe the family could reach these ideals so that it wouldn't, fall on the woman in the household.
Great, thank you very much, Ida. So I'll jump right along to room 4, which comprised of Camilla, Katie, Nat, and Na.
Great, thank you. So I only need 30 seconds, so you can give my 30 seconds to someone else. But really the main takeaway we took from this was around building in moments to pause and reflect and adapt the program to make sure that we're not reinforcing negative gender roles or gender stereotypes, because the program design is necessarily based on a number of assumptions. And so those need to be challenged and reviewed throughout the program to make sure that they're valid and then to adjust the program if it proves that they're not.
Thanks, Nat. I think that's a very good principle for all programming. So lastly, group 6, which was Jeff, Julie, and Cara.
We didn't assign anybody, but I guess I'll go. Yeah, we actually spent a lot of time. Sorry, let me turn on my camera. We've spent a lot of time talking about how traditional marketing campaigns are designed, and that it's all very calculated, and even campaigns that include inclusive models or whatever, it's because it's some sort of trend going on in the market. So when we're thinking about designing these, the SBCC content, is finding messaging that goes across genders. And I think that might be hard, but spending a lot of time, like, what are the key messages that regardless of your gender or sex, can you motivate people to change behavior? And we talked about, like, not saying the son that's going to be the doctor, right? Like talking about it as a child. Yeah, that was pretty much the main topic.
Great, thank you so much for all of those reflections. As we've been going along, Unita has been noting some of your reflections and we'll summarize them at the end of the presentation. I did just want to also give a couple of moments to Biju just to perhaps quickly share on some of the things that Oxfam are planning going forward, and to hear from her whether some of your reflections align with their thinking.
Okay, thank you. So basically, while talking about the mom's magic hand, the way forward could be like develop more gender-focused tools and contents in MMH approach, that is conducting research on motivators for men and other care groups. And other could be like use of gender-sensitive language and examples while conducting the MMH and gender care session, so that all the people in the community, they will have the ownership, because MMH, like when you see the MMH is Mom's Magic Hand, and SuperAmma is like focused on female members. So if you could do some revision of the title of these approach, so it will increase the ownership. And another is mobilization of religious and social leaders as well as the local authority to advocate and carry forward the issue of gender equality, redistribution of care work and gender-based violence. And another could be we can link the activities and frequent engagement with local stakeholders with budget allocation on gender care work and analysis, so that we can contribute some budget for gender analysis, as well as we could have the gender responsive budget, and we can do the gender audit at the end of the project. And the long-term program, as I have mentioned earlier, the 2 years long-term program linking with gender-based violence and women leadership is also very important. So we also have to increase the men's role in storyboard to make men mostly responsible for caring children and engagement in care work. And lastly, I think we have to develop the specific gender and care work monitoring tool, so that we can focus on WAS as well as gender care activities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Biju. And I think what I'm hearing from your comments and from those of others is that really this, to do this well does require us to think about gender at each stage of our programming cycle. So I'd like to hand over to Yanita now as we move into the second phase of this think tank.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sean. Really exciting debate here, and thank you very much for the small groups in such a short time coming up with great inputs. Can we go one slide back? So we want to make this one. We want to make sort of a transition from our thinking to the first hour we focused on practical aspects of gender-sensitive hygiene programming and how we might tweak our work. But as part of the feedback from those small groups, we've already seen some of the larger questions come up. So the last hour now, we want to focus on a critical reflection on the role of the wash sector in changing gender roles and norms. And part of it is how we go about it to do no harm, but then also in the end we want to have a debate with a bit of a controversial notion, maybe to really open up that discussion fully. But sort of as we've done in the first hour, we have an accelerator presentation. Ben has joined us from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Ben does not have a specific WASH focus, but rather looks at the role of gender norms in health programming, and has this really strong link between research and programming. So with this, I'll welcome Ben and take us away into the world of gender norms more general.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to take you away. I want you to stay exactly where you are, because after me there will be more people. But I do want to show you a few slides. There will also be a video that I'd like to show. So could you allow me to when is the right time to share my screen? Is that possible?
Yes, we'll find a way to do that.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, not now. But later. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So a short, incomplete, but hopefully helpful introduction. I think I have now. I burned half of my presentation already, so I'll try and go fast. Next slide. I know you've already discussed. I'll draw on the difference between sex and gender. You don't need to hear this again. Next slide. But just so you know that I'm using a feminist sociological understanding of gender rather than as a system and an order of expectations for men and women and other genders that ascribes and resources, freedoms, and the power, among other things, to people who are associated with a specific gender. So gender and sex affect health differently. This to me is quite interesting. This is causes of DALI. As for those of you who don't know, DALI is a shortcut for bad life. So the more, I mean, yeah, let's put it this way. So this is global burden of disease data. These are good life years, actually, good life years lost. And the purple graph says the causes, the illnesses, the health-related causes of losing good years of life. And the purple says the years of life lost by women disproportionately than men. And the red says men disproportionately by women. So if you look at breast cancer, women lose on average 92.73 times more DALYs, more good years of life, disability adjusted life years, because of breast cancer compared to men. And if we stand to the idea that sex is biological and not socially constructed, which by the way is also being contested, but then we could say, well, then that's related to biological causes. Men do not have the same bodily structure than women. This is why women tend to have breast cancer much more. If you look much lower, trachoma is an infection of the eye. As you know, hygiene, extremely important. Hand hygiene, extremely important for trachoma because you get it through mud. It's an infection of the eye that can lead to blindness. Women get it more because trachoma, the vector of trachoma very often are kids. Women are assigned roles of caregivers because of gender, not because of sex, which is why they're exposed to trachoma. And the same is for men, right? So you have men who have liver cancer much more related to drinking, even though biologically men suffer less from drinking alcohol. Interpersonal violence, because men kill men much more, and it goes on and on. Pneumoconiosis is a funny one, but I'll tell you maybe later. Okay, next slide. So sex and gender affect health differently. What are specifically gender norms? So if gender is an order that includes identity, roles, biases, stereotypes, cognitive schemas, call it whatever you like, it also includes norms, and norms are expectations, unwritten rules about what are acceptable actions, social norms. Gender norms, in the understanding that we gave it in here by choosing a social psychological understanding of the issue, is a subcategories of, gender is a qualifier of norms. So the gender norms define expected actions or appropriate actions for specifically men, women, or other gender minorities in a given group or societies. The social psychological construct wants them to be in the mind, but we know from feminist sociology that they also can be nested in institutions. Think, for instance, about career progression policies and how they interfere with having children, like the tenure in academia. That's an example from a lead poisoning. That's also very important for actually hygiene. Why? Well, lead is transferred by tubes, by pipes. Gates Foundation, one of my friends, big intervention, paint red the unsafe pipes, paint green the safe pipes. Intervention evaluation, they go into this village, this friend of mine interviews the village chief. The village chief says, I know everything about lead poisoning. I know exactly what the intervention is doing. I know exactly that the green pipes are safe. My friend is about to leave, says, just one question, what pipe do you drink from? And the village chief says, this pipe, and guess what, is a red pipe. So my friend says, so you're killing yourself and your entire family. Why that is? Because gathering water is women's role. So there you go, gender norms. And the closest green pipe is in my neighbor's house. And I will not allow my wife to go to the neighbor's house, because what will people say about her? What will people say that she's going in the house for? So this man and his wife prefer to kill themselves and their entire family rather than face social death. Next slide. So how do norms then change? There are four main key strategies or natural evolution of norms. The first one, next slide, being laws and policies. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, and one of the champions of this is Antanas Mokus. Great work. The law-norm relationship is a little bit delicate. 62 country study, I think it was, on child marriage found 0% of influence of the law on the actual practice of child marriage when there was a social norm in place. So laws and policies don't in itself tend to change behavior in places where there is weak control of the territory by the state. but they can start, if they are just about, they can contribute to norm change. I'm not going to go into this, but look at the work of Antanas Mokus. As a policy, he fired all corrupt police officers and he replaced them with mimes, which lowered by 80% traffic-related deaths, because that changed driving norms in Bogota. And my colleague Jerry Mackey has written about it in the book in there. Okay, next slide. The second strategy is mass media. I don't know if you can, I want to show you then this little video, just so that you don't hear just me speaking. I understand it can be a bit boring and my Italian accent is a bit strong. So this is the story of a man, obviously, who doesn't wash his hands, and what they're trying to do with this video is they're trying to create the belief that you will be disapproved if you don't wash your hands. So using really social norms theory, then there would be a positive Carter who washes his hands with soap, and then the video ends with everyone shaking hands, and this man is accepted back in the society after he's washed his hands as well. And then it ends by saying, respect people, use soap. So building on what was considered a traditional value. So if we go back to the slides, so that's the second strategy, social media campaigns. The third strategy, and I understand I usually do a 5-day training course on this, so I understand I'm going a little bit fast and you have many questions. Next slide. Another strategy is normative feedback. These changes has been found to change norms. Normative feedback can be either individualized or group feedback. When it's individualized, it gives feedback to people about how they are comparing, they are performing, comparing to their peers. My computer is trying to take off. So in a way, this is used by saying, for instance, hey, do you know that most of your neighbors wash their hands every wash their hands every now and then, and you're doing much better, or you're doing much less. And these you can send. This has been done with SMS messages. This has been done with letters. This has been done in various ways, and it's been found to work, especially for those who were underperforming, to push them to comply. Those who were overperforming also tend to come to the center, so they added an injunctive message by saying to the overperformers, very good job, you're at the best, and that in itself moderated the effect of getting back to the center. Or, next slide, the feedback can be done to a group. So if you click again, this is being done in US campuses, especially, and this is called the social norms approach developed by Alan Berkowitz, with whom I've written a paper that is actually looking at the difference between this and the next. So we have, this has been done in many universities, in many examples, but essentially the idea here is that people tend to do what other people around them do. So if they think nobody washes their hands, actually they won't wash their hands. So by correcting misperception and saying 95% of people exactly like you wash their hands, there is an increased probability that they wash their hands. A study was done in public toilets in New York, which is a study that is very funny and which could be replicated. They also found that it's not just about what other people do, it's about also being judged. And so when they measured how many people wash their hands after having been to the toilet in an empty bathroom, and that was, I don't know, whatever, 50%, say, and then they measured how many people wash their hands when there was another person washing their hands and looking at them, and this spiked up to 85–90%. So the idea of being judged as not washing your hands increased likelihood of people washing their hands. And then the last strategy, next slide, is group discussions, which is mostly community conversations that allow critical reflection about common experiences. To me, this is the most powerful, particularly effective. Is based on people-led approaches. It allows people to diagnose, identify, and name together problems in their social reality, and devise political and cultural compatible strategies to address those problems. And there is a theory of change that I developed based on the work of this NGO Tostan that is published in one of my books, but I'm not going to go into it in detail. So if you just click through it, but it's a multi-step, it's a 3-step that starts by creating motivation in a small group, and then next slide, expanding to the larger group. Again, next slide, and then the next slide again, expanding to the larger group, and then achieving moments of visible change in which a new normative equilibrium is sealed, so that nobody can say, well, I didn't know, right? So in this community now, we commit publicly to internally to vaccinating our children, for instance. So this is, I think this is my last slide, and if you click, we'll find out. Yes, this is my last slide. So I guess this is really as much as I can say in 10 minutes. But of course, I don't know if you plan to have any questions, and I understand it's very preliminary and introductory, but I hope this might serve you well to push you to. And I sent in my bio also some readings that you may want to do, I think, and I'm happy to, if you have any questions on an email or anything that can help your work, to just ping me and I'll be there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. This has been great inputs and great food for thought. There's already been a bit of a disagreement with some of the points in the chat box, which I think I'd ask people to hold on to those. If there's any clarification questions, please do raise them now or put them in the chat box. Otherwise, we will keep you, but part you into smaller groups to have a debate going now, like really practicing what Sean mentioned in the beginning, this open mindset. And when we were preparing this session, we were even debating whether we can debate this notion, because it seemed to be a universally accepted thing. Well, it is a universally accepted stand that handwashing programs should aim to contribute to changing gender norms towards more gender equality through its activities. Our question, I think that has been shining through throughout this session, is what role does the wash sector have to play, and how do we play this role effectively? I think there's a recognition. I put some points for thoughts and reflections as inputs for the discussion, and on the bottom here, there's really no neutral ground, as Bethany mentioned right in the beginning. There's sort of this the perpetuating gender stereotypes to gender transformative wash, but there's really no way of being neutral on this, and from my perspective, I see a lot. There's a lot of saying that we'll do this and commitment to do this, but there's very sort of the practice is lagging behind a little bit. We've already talked about, I think Bijou's presentation illustrated quite nicely, so the difference between more general gender norms that shape wash behavior and wash participation, and specific gender norms related to wash. So the question of who fetches the water is of course connected to a larger discussion about who takes responsibilities for certain tasks and certain realms within the household. We've also heard separately, that hasn't come up a lot in the last hour, but we've heard a lot of short-term wash interventions, usually like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, versus a change in gender dynamics that takes usually a longer time, a generation or 2 or 3. So what's the tension there? And then the last point on sort of thoughts for inputs, or food for thought, the sort of our external watch program designs, often there's like a standard set of message and gender roles that are brought to a community that may be in conflict with the wishes and aspirations of the target communities themselves. This argument we've already touched on earlier. So we want to, through this debate, we really want to force you to take on a perspective that you might not have argued for through your opinion, but really try to find arguments for this position that you're taking, and seeing how you can then in this debate with the other position then eventually find a middle ground. So the way this will work is we'll split you into groups into 8 groups. You'll have 2 or 3 people in this group, and you'll have 10 minutes to prepare your argument. So make up your strongest arguments to defend your side, and then you're merged with another group, and you have another 10 minutes to debate this other group. And we ask you to defend your point, and really seeing how you can how you can find a conversation on between the 2 sides. We hope that eventually through this debate you'll find sort of a middle ground will emerge, and we'd be curious to hear about that middle ground. And then we will come back into the plenary, and we'll ask you to share back your best argument for and against the notion, and to share where you found or where you can see middle ground. So we'll, as I said, we'll split you to 8 groups. You have 10 minutes to prepare your arguments before you're being merged with another group. Group 1 to 4 will argue in favor of this notion. So you will argue that yes, all hand washing programs should aim to contribute to changing gender norms. And group 5 to 8 will argue against it, so that we need that not all hand washing programs need to aim to contribute to changing gender norms. Any clarification questions on that? Then I'll put in the chat box the spreadsheet where you can again take notes, so we can capture all of the arguments, and we'll send you off into the small groups. And looking forward to hearing what you come up with in this debate. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a controversial discussion, and you all got to exchange really good arguments. Just as a reminder, we saw not everybody was typing into the spreadsheet. We'll just share the spreadsheet again in the chat box. So if you can retroactively add some of the arguments that you've exchanged and that may have convinced you to put it in there, so we can capture all of that in the proceedings of the session. But before we do that, so we'd love to hear from the 4 debates on your best argument in favor and against this notion of all hand washing programs should aim to contribute to changing gender norms towards more gender equality through its activities. And I would call on just 1 to 4. On the first group, Abby and John debating against Ben, Na, and Robert. Would any of you like to report back to the group?
Let me make a stab at it. It's John. Trying to be careful because clearly we won, right? But that might not be the view of everyone in the group. No, so the thrust of the argument was to say that I think on the one hand we highlighted that because of the pandemic, there's a higher visibility of hand washing programs, and that might be an argument for a higher level of responsibility, but also an opportunity to use those programs to address cultural issues like gender inequality. And the counter argument was to say that we need to remain clear to our context, and that though it's always, we should always be gender sensitive and be aware, but it might be going beyond the scope and going beyond the remit of handwashing programs to think or believe that they can or should aim to be gender transformative. And I think it was Robert, I hope I've tried to frame that argument appropriately. So it was really, I think really coming down to certainly wanting to be on the right side of the spectrum, but perhaps recognizing the difference between, in terms of the size of the opportunity and wanting to make sure that the core focus was retained. I hope I got that about right.
Transmuted, thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Anything else from this group to add to this? Then I would move to the second debate, Ida and Jacqueline debating Julie and Katie. If you could share some of your the best argument on either side, and if it's the same as the previous group, if you could complement, that would be great. If nobody volunteers, I would just call on Ida to report on behalf of the group. Or Katie. Katie just opened her microphone.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry, always going around here. Yeah, so we were talking about the higher visibility and how it's a good opportunity to change gender norms for sure, because it is such a vital point to every part of the household right now. But also we were talking more for the in favor, looking more at sort of the sustainability of handwashing programs and sort of our role to do no harm. Whereas if you're trying to go for a what if you would call it a gender neutral approach, the way we're sort of interpreting gender norms in the community today, with the focuses that we have had as women as leading hand hygiene in the household, you would risk reinforcing those stereotypes and in that potentially causing harm with your programming. So we're in favor of incorporating sort of gender sensitive programming to try and avoid that, but then also try and use this situation as an opportunity to sort of shift those norms in a more gentle way. I think, Katie, they did have some good against points. So, Kate, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, Ida, I think you summarised really well, and we did very much agree in the end in our discussion about the long-term versus short-term and sustainability. Our against points, because we had to make them, were really more focused around thinking about our primary goal of hand washing and trying to save lives, and thinking about that we might, thinking we might be able to do that better by tapping into the existing norms in the places where we're working, and talking about how hard it is sometimes to change behaviour, and trying to avoid diluting focus and attention away from saving lives and hand washing, if that was our primary goal. So that was just another point if we needed to make one for the against, but in general I think we were all quite in agreement.
Great, thank you so much for this reflection, and great you found a middle ground and an agreement between the groups. I'll pass over to the group room number 3 with Kara and Nat debating against Bethany, Julia, and Michael. I don't know who from the group would like to report back.
I'll take a stab at it from the pro side, and then ask and Kara to add as well. So basically what we found is that there are, and I think this is consistent with what you've heard already, there are strong and positive gender norms out there, and that those can be leveraged to strengthen hand hygiene programs and use them to further reinforce a behavior, and potentially expand that behavior into other contexts. So be it, making sure about cleaning hands before preparing meals, or after cleaning a child, and that these are opportunities to reinforce the behavior, but also not to set up the challenge of really trying to change an entire set of norms, which is extremely challenging and takes quite a bit of time, but rather to utilize the what's already there as a strong tool and channel to reinforce hand hygiene behaviors. Over.
Great, thank you very much. Anyone else from the group would like to add anything to this?
Nope, I think Nat captured it very succinctly.
Perfect. Then we'll move to the last group, Jeff and Heidi debating Bijou, Camila, and Ron. Anyone from this group would like to report back on any of the arguments that convinced you but haven't been raised yet?
So I think everything has been covered, but as mentioned earlier, we'll not have the focus program, and we cannot have the larger impact when both the WAS as well as the gender norms are combined. We will have a vague activity, so we are not focused and will not get the larger impact or the visible impact. That is one thing. And another is the government also, they are willing to see the wash facilities, that is the hand washing. If we promote the hand washing, we'll have the hand washing facilities. But if we promote the gender norms, it's the software activities. So government are also not willing to promote the software activities. So for the ownership of the government, the hand washing activity with the facilities is very important.
Great,
and just to expand on that a little bit, that by tackling gender issues within a larger hand washing or wash program, I mean, are we going to do that badly and perhaps do more harm than good?
Great. Thanks a lot for those reflections. I think that's a really great point to add to the mix on government ownership and an extension of that community ownership of some of those programs. We had a packed agenda. We're running a bit out of time, so Sean has captured all of the main points here. Please also add them in the spreadsheet, so we make sure we capture all of those great thinking and ideas. And so last 5 minutes, we'd like to get some reflection feedback from you on sort of key takeaways from this session, and then summarize and next steps. So I just shared in the chat box the Menti link. If you would go to skip one slide and go to the next slide, and I'll actually start sharing my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
There are answers starting to come in. So please either go to menti.com and enter the code 914744. Or just click on the link that I have shared in the chat box. So we'd like to hear a little bit from you, sort of how this has changed your thinking, if at all. And just giving a few minutes for everybody to respond. So we have 12 responses right now. For those that have already responded, you can think of already the next question: what are some of the key takeaways and main ideas that you've taken away from this? So that'll be a free text, but we'll just wait here for another couple of minutes. 16 responses. So we'll have sort of a middle to so some important new ideas and a lot of new ideas which I want to think about and discuss further. So that's great here, and as Sean said in the beginning, we'll even preparing for the session, we had some important reflections and it changed significantly on our side. Now, I'm not a Menti expert, and I'm trying to see how I can change to the next slide. Maybe I have to go to this one. Can you already access the next slide?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So we'd ask you to please name one thing that most surprised you about today's session, and what would be the one key takeaway from the session. So just a couple of ideas and thoughts that that might have not been as prominent, that you think this is something that would be great to take away and think further about, maybe discuss with your team, see how you can bring it into your programming. Key takeaway: it's difficult to argue against integrating gender into hand hygiene programming. Debating. When it comes to debating, is that maybe you can put in the chat box whether that's something positive or that's like rather difficult, or whether it helped you to take on a different perspective. Great to learn from Oxfam, doing work that looks at Oxfam is already doing work that looks at gender outcomes. Great case studies from many different perspectives. This was very useful. Coming in some more, a lot of good resources out there that I didn't know about. That's always great. Integrating Mom's Magic Hands and gender norms. That was certainly very interesting for me also to hear about the integration and sort of a larger, not just hand washing gender norms, but a larger sort of participation in household chores, etc. And then we shouldn't shy away from being more proactive for gender equality in our hygiene work. So in the interest of time, we just want to wrap up. Then I'd asked to go back to the main set of slides. We'll all capture these and sort of make sure we're there we go. We're capturing all of these great points that you have mentioned, and please keep them going, share them even afterwards. We have put, we've sort of taken notes during the sessions, just a couple of points from our reflection. If we could, yeah, we have shared the slides again. If you could go to slide number 41. So some of the points for us that stood out were the differences, so the practical thinking about the differences between sex-specific hand hygiene needs and gender-specific expectations regarding hand hygiene, and then some reflections on the unintended and intended consequences of gender goals regarding hygiene and how we might address that in this a complex reality, be mindful of how programs could contribute to pressure, guilt, and shame when linking parenting behavior to children's health outcomes. I think that was a great, very general question. Taking time to understanding existing gender roles and dynamics. I think there was a consensus at the end of sort of the first group discussion, and then build in moments for to pause, reflect, and adjust programming. And then for marketing, I thought that was an interesting point. Then present a range of present a range of gender roles and avoid stereotyping. For the marketing, that point was the second to last point here. Can we find messaging across gender lines, and but also jump and possibly reinforcing gender trends? There's been some quite disruptive marketing in recent years, especially when it comes to minutes and some of that. So really jumping on that train to reinforce some of those trends, and then embedding hand hygiene into larger gender norms programs, as we've seen in Nepal, and utilize common norms based on behavior change techniques when also thinking about changing gender norms. Sean will do a quick recap of the last 1 hour of sort of some of the key points, and then I'll share some resources. Over to you, Sean.
Next slide, please. So very quickly, I think we've heard lots of practical examples of kind of what I've termed here as micro actions that can help us be more gender aware in our programming. But equally, I think we need to be realistic about what our programs can and cannot achieve as long-term goals. It sounds like a kind of middle ground that we reached is that it's key that we need to work with partners, and particularly government and populations, to encourage them to lead on larger gender norms change, and that maybe one of our roles is to specifically consider some of those norms related to enabling hand washing and related to wash, but recognizing, of course, that if we are more gender aware, this might actually help to facilitate longer term sustainability of our programs. Next slide, please. Over to you, Unita.
Yeah, so we'll, apologies for keeping you 5 minutes over time. We have, in preparation for this session, we've done a bit of a literature review, and while this is not non-exhaustive, and we'll invite everybody to contribute to this document as well, but we wanted to share those resources because they are available, and so some of the literature that we've built our thinking on and structured the session around to share, and with the open invitation to contribute to this document. As Sean mentioned earlier, we'll synthesize the session in a blog, sort of key themes and takeaways to allow this discussion to continue and to trickle into the discussion at sector level, and then we'll encourage a continuation at your workplace, at your organization, and at regional level by making available some of the materials and presentations, as well as a facilitation guide on the questions and discussions that we've had in this session. So with this, thank you very much for your participation, for your thoughts and inputs, and we'll meet again on Friday, the 14th, for the private sector partnerships session of the think tank. I want to thank you all. Thank